much, Delana. Again, thank you again for joining us in our third presentation in this series. Hopefully for many folks out there who may have joined us for all three. Thank you for going on this journey with us. And if you are joining us for the first time, that is totally fine because we have all of these webinars recorded, and we'll definitely give you information in terms of how to access the other presentations. So let's go ahead and dig right in just with a few housekeeping items. So for our agenda, kind of like what we've done for our other webinars, we'll definitely do our welcome and overview. And then with our last two webinars, being Policing 101 and Defund 101, before we dig into local advocacy, which will be led by Jen Samano, and then we'll talk a little bit about our messaging when it comes to divestment and an investment model. And then how you might be able to contact your local representatives and a call to action to make your voice heard in terms of looking for alternative means of safety outside of policing, followed by Q&A, which will all be here. And we are also being joined by our senior policy counsel, Rebecca Wallace, if anyone has some particular policy or legal related questions. So the goals for today are, pretty straightforward. Our educational goals, again, are to mobilize around a clear vision, to invest in community safety by providing tools to start talking about divestment from law enforcement and investment in community services. And again, our outreach goals kind of one and the same in terms of we want to begin to start getting comfortable with contacting our local representatives to express support for more civilian-led community services. Okay. So some community norms, which is something that we go through in each of our webinars, is, certainly, again, we encourage people to participate and ask questions along the way. So if you put anything in the chat or in the Q&A, certainly please feel free to do so as we are going through this presentation. And again, the topic around policing and divestment is certainly going to be something very new to a lot of us. And so certainly just continuing to be open-minded to the learning process. And again, that's kind of where asking questions along the way becomes very helpful. And then also just respecting others' experiences, because again, we are talking about the topic of policing, which in of itself for many communities is a tough one to tackle and to talk about. And so just being, again, respectful that some folks have other experience than you do, and that's okay. Again, we're all here to learn and support each other. So before we go into today's presentation in terms of learning how to advocate on divesting from law enforcement and investing in more alternative measures of safety, we want to do a bit of a recap of our last two webinars, starting with Policing 101. So certainly, again, on October 8th, we held our first webinar on policing, and basically this was to talk about the origins of policing and really just kind of educating ourselves on why police reforms aren't really enough in order to kind of eliminate some of that pervasive police violence and discriminatory policing that we have been seeing, particularly in recent months. And so from that conversation, we definitely discussed about modern policing in our country is really designed as a system of social control. So certainly we have in the South, where that looked like more of slave patrols in order to keep control of those who were enslaved, as well as create kind of more of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And particularly in the North, what we saw is that policing was really kind of designated to protect the interests of the wealthy class, and thereby turning social problems, quote unquote, crime control. What the other thing that we discussed is that the leading moderate reforms that we've been seeing by major police departments across the country have really not been enough to end that kind of racial disparities in policing. So again, we looked at the report Beyond Policing, and we looked at how, particularly in large cities across the country that have implemented reforms such as chokehold bans, doing implicit bias training. There's just not really enough empirical evidence to suggest that that is helping to deter discriminatory policing. And so if that be the case, if we do know that policing is a form of social control and these reforms are not working, then what is it that we need to do in order to end this cycle and reimagine or imagine a new vision of community safety? Last week in our Defund 101 webinar that was led by our wonderful Smart Justice organizer, Elizabeth X, we talked about visioning a world of safety is visioning a world without policing and caging our neighbors. And so we did a bit of a visioning exercise where we really asked folks to really think about what does safety look like for them, and what are some of those feelings that kind of conjure up for that. And we did a bit of a word cloud where people who did attend kind of just put in like the first 3 words that they were thinking about when they think about safety. And so certain words popped up such as peace, community, liberation, connectedness, which were all really great terms. But we also wanted to note in the exercise the words that we did not see pop up related to what we think of in terms of safety: policing, surveillance, or militarization. Those didn't pop up in the word cloud, which we think is really important to note as we continue to, continue on this journey to build a different world when we're discussing alternatives. The divest and invest model, including reducing the size of police budgets and increasing community services. So Elizabeth was definitely talking again about what do we mean when we're talking about defund, particularly here in Colorado. And that defund is really just kind of the short term of the divest invest model, shifting resources away from local and state police budgets and reinvesting it into communities for services that neighbors are really asking for, whether it be mental health services, social service programs, housing, and so forth. And so when we say this, we're really talking about community-based programs that are not parallel to policing, because we do know that social services can be a form of policing if we are not careful. So those were kind of one of those things that, we talked about, and we talked about like, these things aren't going to happen overnight. And that ending kind of, what we see in terms of excessive policing really is going to require a thoughtful deliberation and participation from all of us. And then third, divesting from police is not about moderate police reforms or giving police departments more resources. And so, when we're talking about the divest invest model, we're not talking about spending more outfits, to outfit police with body cameras, where we're not talking about pushing for more training without a commitment to decreasing the police system. And we're not talking, about again, some of these other reforms that kind of pop up. We're really talking about revisioning the way we see our safety and shifting that more into community hands. And in addition to that, there was a phrase that Elizabeth said in terms of like defund or divesting is not a shell game. So example, when we're talking about removing police from schools, we can't say that we're going to shuffle money from a police budget and into an education budget, but still hire SROs. So that's not defunding, that's just, again, relabeling. So again, these are concepts to really think about. as we continue to have this conversation when it comes to divestment. So with that, I want to hand it over to Jen, who will kind of lead us into what does it mean in terms of local advocacy as it relates to making contacts with individuals or with officials who have the power to make changes in kind of the process towards moving towards alternative forms of safety. So I hand it off to Jen.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, so to get started, I think what is the most obvious example of why local advocacy is important is what the uprising from this summer, the reckoning that we are in. We're long overdue for criminal legal reform, but what that shows us is that is all local work. The power to make those changes rests in local government, which is far less sexy than your senators and your presidents and executive branches and all of those things. But it's far more important in terms of this issue and making tangible change. And I would also like to think that this is really broadly speaking, but after 2016, there was a lot more people who were involved in political advocacy and action. And all of a sudden, people were first of all, knew who their House representative was and their senators were, and knew them so well that they were calling them regularly. Like, you know, they'd be out with friends back when we could still really do that and calling their senators. So taking that spirit and that level of context and dedication onto the local level will lead to even greater and more direct impact. We'll dive in a little deeper to get grounded in it. Next slide, please, Jess. Okay, so why does it matter? Where do we do this? I like to say that it's advocacy that's under your feet. What happens in local government and local politics will directly affect advocates and voters or community members. It's the cracks in the sidewalks, the potholes, your garbage service, but also, you know, that's how local transportation and businesses are regulated on the local level. And of course, our police, schools, and fire are all the local level. And so they're all regulated on the local level by representatives and through processes just like on the federal level or the statewide level, which we're more used to working with and seeing. And so it's also important to think of local advocacy as community advocacy. This is advocacy that affects your neighborhood directly. Your representatives, just kind of getting ahead of myself, will know about that corner you're talking about with the potholes because they're just working in smaller, or they might know, I shouldn't promise on their behalf. So they're working in smaller jurisdictions. It's really that similar, or that simple. When you're dealing with your House rep on the federal level, you're one of hundreds of thousands. Your senator on the federal level, you're one of millions. Your city council member, you're one of thousands, and in some municipalities even less. So logically, you're more likely to have a greater impact. And so that not only means your community and neighborhood, but also it's your municipal level government and your county level government, especially when you get outside of the Front Range in the Denver metro area. Your county commissioners might be really important people for your local issues, and also your school boards. And when we're talking about criminal legal reform and when we're talking about divest, your school boards will play a role. We've seen that already in the work that's been done to disentangle SROs with schools. So it seems kind of obvious, but I think it's worth naming and being explicit about when we're in such a busy environment. And I know a lot of activist types might be working on a statewide campaign and making calls to their senators, but this is to just focus on down. If you want to go to the next slide, thank you. Again, it's the most effective means of advocacy is to do it on the local level. And also what's really important is there's an increased level of accessibility. In a literal sense, all of the buildings, your buildings, your city council meetings are all likely to be a lot closer than if you were doing advocacy at a different level. And that's really important because you want to bring in as many people as possible in a diverse coalition. So not just the people who might be retired and have extra time, or people who might have a profession that allows, family structure that allows them a lot of time. The key ingredient to advocacy is time. And so this accessibility factor is really important, because if you're wanting to bring in your neighbors, probably not going to convince them to drive 45 minutes in the evening to go to a city council meeting. But if it's 10 minutes away, maybe. And also, the impact is direct. Again, it's under your feet. SROs leaving school, students will notice that immediately. It's not a bill that's being passed that will take a long time to trickle down and be felt. And also, which is really important, it's been clear now that you have a higher success rate advocating at the local level, going to city council meetings, building relationships with your representatives. But it's also important because while you're acting locally, this is back to that what's become kind of a trite saying of, act locally, think globally. But by making change on a local level, it helps create a ripple and a precedent, right? A town that is able to pass some form or reallocate funding into an alternative to policing is more likely to get their neighbors on the Western Slope to be persuadable, right? They're like, well, if the town of Carbondale is doing it, then maybe there's more political room for me to do it. And then also getting to a point where it's like, if all of these places are doing it, then why aren't we? So that kind of political peer pressure is really important. The how do you do this? We'll get into more about how to talk to your local representatives and find them. We have some cheat sheets for some of the cities as a spoiler. But I think this is really important, is to follow local news and reporters. Local news has been a bit decimated in the past few years due to conglomeration and lack of funds, the loss of paper advertising. However, Colorado's local news scene is relatively more robust than others, and you still have a local paper. So even if it's not your favorite, you should consult it to just find basic information on what's going on in your city. You can also follow local reporters on Twitter. I don't usually recommend Twitter for anything, but I do like it for following local reporters and getting that beat on what's actually going on in your city. So get in the habit of looking at local news. Also, knowing groups that operate at a state, city, or neighborhood level. I live in Capitol Hill in Denver, so I know we have Cap Hill United Neighbors Association. There's like those community groups. Start to follow them, maybe get on their newsletters, see what they're doing, because by doing that, you'll get a broader view of what the local landscape looks like. And of course, you can see places where you have alignments with other groups that have already been doing work or might want to do what you're trying to do. And this last one seems small, right? Talk to your family and friends, especially and particularly the ones who live near you or under the same jurisdiction of the local government. This is what we call relational organizing, which is really just old school community organizing. And it means that you talk intentionally with friends and family who might be with you but need the extra push. You are more powerful than your mayor, than these local news reporters or these neighborhood groups. You are, as a family member or a friend, a trusted messenger that is able, who is best able to influence friends. I will leave it with a statistic. Let's say ACLU reaches out and says, hey, contact your local city council person. Tell them to do X, Y, and Z with the city budget, the teaser. About 3% of those people, this is a likelihood, will take that action, which can be really great. It's still tangible. if you were to ask your neighbor who you're kind of friendly with to do that same thing, they're 22% more likely to take that action. So you have a lot of power. And I'll pass it back to Jeff.
Thank you, thank you. So now that we have had a chance to hear from Jen about like how, advocating and talking with your local representatives, or even going beyond talking with your friends and family about, issues that matter to you. In this case, in context, we're talking about, divesting from law enforcement and investing in more community-led services. We wanted to go over a little bit with you in terms of messaging that might be helpful as you proceed to have these conversations. So a lot of the messaging that we're using from the Movement for Black Lives. They are an awesome grassroots organization that really has been at the forefront of having conversations around divestment and investment. So when we're talking about divesting from police, what do we really mean? And so, we're talking about shifting massive spending on policing and reinvesting in a shared vision of community safety. So when we're talking about this, we're talking really about doing a major pivot in our social priorities. We need to see this shift of massive spending from police that we know is not keeping us safe, and into more of an investment of services that actually work. And we'll talk, a bit about one of them that we see here in Denver that we see working. So again, we know that this is not going to happen overnight, but we have to acknowledge again that these moderate reforms that we usually are relying on when we see that systems aren't working is just not going to cut it. And so ending, again, the excessive force and violence is again going to really take some thoughtful, deliberate, and more participatory approach from all of us. Acknowledging that some of the safest neighborhoods in the country are places that don't center the police. And so we know that, what we're looking for already exists. And, to call it out, and we already know that it works. We don't have to look any further than the neighborhoods where there is wealth, they're well connected, are well off, predominantly tends to be white. And we see these communities working without centering police. So if it can work for them, then it can work for the rest of us. And so again, what are we imagining here? We're imagining a place where, if we're not worried about our safety from police violence, then we can shift our focus and our energies to accessing living wages and healthcare and quality public education. And again, freedom from again, police force and terror that we've been seeing within the past few months, and particularly kind of really historically. Third is that public safety is the responsibility of elected officials in communities and not private or contract policing. So in this moment, we know that there are multiple cities in the US, even here in Colorado, that are rethinking their municipal budgets in relation to how we fund police departments. And so this again is really an opportunity for us to lean into divestment principles by, again, really calling for our elected officials, our local officials, to start shifting these resources to infrastructures that don't rely on policing to keep our communities safe. So with that, of course, with, having this messaging, tough questions might come up. And so here are a few that, we think that could come up if someone was to ask you about divestment and investment. So a question, what do we mean by defund or divest? Again, this is really about rejecting the expansion of police budgets and resources, and that almost every city in the country is currently rethinking their budget because of COVID. And so right now, cities are rethinking their budgets, reevaluating whether the jobs that police are doing can be handled by civilian-led services that, again, are really more equipped to ensure that public safety. And again, using kind of what we said in the previous slide, this is really a unique opportunity for us to begin to share the vision that we've been talking about, particularly in the last webinar, about what we vision community safety to look like. Another question that might come up is that, well, if we divest from police, then what are the alternatives to community safety? And certainly we can say an example is a mental health crisis program. So, we talked about imagine if there's someone on the street who is having trouble, and instead of calling the police, we're able to call a service that can get the help that they need. So if you have a friend or a family member going through an episode, would you want the police to respond, knowing that it might end up with a loved one injured or killed in the process? Or would you want someone who understands, mental health issues, someone who's been there, someone who's trained to address the situation safely? So again, for example, we have Denver STAR program, which is currently a pilot program that dispatches a van for mental health emergencies, and unarmed professionals with mental health training, social work training. They have even training on chemical and dependency issues. They come out, assist, provide services, and use de-escalation techniques. And within the first 2 months of operating the STAR van, with hundreds of calls, 0 of those calls had to be escalated to police contact. Those are kind of the services that we are looking at and what we're talking about. And we'll talk about that a bit more, as if we know that services like this work, then how do we continue to expand a program that exists in Denver, and how do we get other cities to begin considering similar programs? Another tough question is, if we divest from police, well, who's going to keep us safe? And again, we mentioned this in our first webinar in terms of what the role of policing really has been in this country, and that despite what we've been taught, policing has not made our neighborhoods safer. Again, policing is designed for social control and not crime prevention. So in addition, we've talked about, again, moderate police reforms have not been sufficient to eliminate police violence and disparities in our criminal legal system. And so using divestment from police is really a transition from over-reliance on excessive and discriminatory policing to demilitarized safety strategies. And that's really the way to go. And that we can be creative, we can innovate new approaches to security and accountability that better serves the needs of our neighbors. And just to let folks know that, as we have done with the previous webinars, we will be providing a recording as well as providing the presentation slides, so that way you have this ready, to go if you, do go out and begin to engage in conversations of this way. So now that we have that, I'm going to turn it back to Jen to talk a bit about, now that we kind of have a bit of messaging, we know how that advocacy works, how do we combine those pieces to begin to start reaching out to our local representatives?
Thanks, Jess. You could go to the next slide, actually. Okay, so first is to familiarize yourself with who are your local representatives and what committees do they sit on. And that can start with something as simple as a Google search. There's also a way to, or if you are a voter in Colorado, you can go to your online voter registration, view your file, and you will see all of the districts and jurisdictions you are in, including school board. I really highly recommend doing that, if you're a voter, use your voter registration and check out all the districts that you are a constituent of. It's a really good exercise, and it's really good to familiarize yourself. But then from there, getting a little bit more granular. Outside of your direct city councilor, who else are the city councilors? Who is the mayor? What committees do they have? And then determine when they regularly meet. This should be relatively obvious on the city government website. So have like a calendar, and because they have to publicly post their meeting schedules. From there, you can see if those are open to the public, which many are. And then you'll also get information on participation, which will look different depending on meeting, depending on jurisdiction as well. It could be that you're allowed to submit written comments, or it could be that you're allowed to come in person and give 1 minute of testimony or comment. In today's environment, that's often on Zoom, but not always. It will depend on, again, on your locality. And I will say this, when you are looking up your local representatives, depending on where you are, the websites can look very out of date, but that means you're probably in the right place. You're probably in the .gov official website. And because there's this varying degree of, you know, tech savviness in different cities, it might just take some poking around. For example, I was looking for something really specific in Aurora City Council once, and I couldn't find it, so I just picked up the phone and called the city council number. These are, again, that's the beauty of working on the local level, is it's so much smaller than if I picked up the phone to try and find out a bit of information from Senator Cory Gardner's office. So don't be afraid to familiarize yourself with these local municipalities. Pick up the phone, ask, make calls. But again, we have some cheat sheets for you in terms of how to city councilors, who they are and what their contacts are. We have 2 different sheets that lay it out for you if you're living in Denver, Aurora, or if you're living in Boulder. Also, Greeley, Pueblo, and Grand Junction. So we will share those out. And you might be saying, Jen, I obviously am determined and an activist. I would just look this up on my own. This also goes back to talking to your friends, family, and neighbors, right? It's even easier for them, or it's even harder for them to say no if you can just be like, hey, I'll shoot you this spreadsheet so you can do it. I highlighted the person for you. So keep that in mind. Okay, so it's also important when doing local advocacy to representatives to be persistent. Make this advocacy a habit. Of course, there'll be different peak times, like the budget process, or if we need to respond to something that's happening in the community. But regardless of those peaks, try and make it consistent even when you're quiet. Because, you know, politicians might be like, this is a fad that will blow over in a week, so I'll just weather the storm. But if you show up after the storm is past, you're sending a much stronger message and being more effective. This is similar to the next point, which is show up for good and bad. And this means that if your representative is doing something that is in line with your values and in line with this work, make sure that you shout them out, let them know. You know, that could be an email, or if you're a social media user, it could be on Twitter. But that positive reinforcement is really strategic and critical. We can't just show up when someone's doing something wrong. I mean, you can and you should, and we will as ACLU, but it's going to be more effective in the long term for us as advocates to also be there when someone is doing something good. And this is the last bit, or just tips to when you're actually talking with a representative. And again, in this environment, it could be a Zoom meeting, it could be in person with masks on, or it could be over email. But regardless, these tips can be applied and should be. They're kind of best practice tips. So be clear when you're talking and advocating to a representative on what exactly you want. Specificity is important. You know, you don't want to say, well, I want to end racism, or even I want to divest from police. I want you to allocate money to the STAR program, or thank you for allocating money to the STAR program. It's more specific. Also know who you're talking to. Of course, you want to know your representative's name. It's important to their role on city council, and if applicable, any committees that they might sit on, but definitely their name and role. This know how to talk to them is exactly what Jeff just presented us with, is that messaging. Make sure you're on message and on framework. What makes, when you see lobbyists the stereotypical lobbyist of someone who's paid by industry, they're really good at sticking to their talking points, and so are politicians. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's effective in driving the message. And it's okay to be repetitive if you're meeting with someone 3 times and telling them similar talking points as to why you care. That's good. Just make sure that you're also giving them a specific ask. This last point is super critical. Know how to follow up and make sure you actually do it. And that could just be an acknowledgement email, thanks for meeting. It could be, we talked last week, wanted to see if you needed any more information. But that, again, goes back to the persistence. And that's what I have for knowing your local representatives. Oh, the other thing, again, sorry to belabor the point, is that when you're working on a local level, your representatives will often be more accessible. I know a lot offer like regular coffee hours to meet, so that's a positive, and we encourage you to take up that opportunity. I'm done.
Cool. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jess, for all that buildup. I'll try to live up to it. My name is Julian Camera, he, him, his. So how can we tie all this together? What we do is we do strategic calls to action where we find channels and ways for our elected officials to hear the demands of the community. So that can come in the form of phone calls, emails, social media posting, protesting, showing up to city council hearings, writing letters to your elected officials, hosting events. The list goes on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the role of a city budget, the process for developing one, and how you can advocate during the budget process on the issues you care about, because like Jen said, you are the most powerful messenger. So what is the role of a city budget? A city budget, it weighs policy priorities against available resources. It specifies the means of providing public programs and services. It establishes the cost of programs and the criteria by which these programs will be evaluated for efficiency and effectiveness. It ensures that programs will be evaluated at least once each budget cycle. It provides the government with a spending limitation. And finally, and very importantly, it provides transparency by which the government may be held accountable at the end of each budget cycle or political term. So it's helpful to know this because funding for programs such as STAR or discussions about police divestment are things that are proposed and decided on in the city budget process. So as far as the process itself goes, this is something that takes place every year, and it covers the budget for the following year. So right now, the city budget that's being decided, it's for 2021, and it's the planning process for the 2021 budget started at the beginning of 2020. So it is a long process, and the first step in the city budget process, it begins with preparation. In this period, city officials are mapping out proposals for the year while at the same time keeping in mind the available revenues. So in Denver, specifically during this period, the chief financial officer reviews budget and capital improvement proposals. And this took place in Denver specifically for between January and March this year. And then between April and June, officials prepared budget calendars and procedures. Between July to September, the mayor reviewed and approved the proposed budget and then submitted his budget for review by September 15th. So once the mayor submitted the budget, city council then hosts public hearings to gather input from local residents. This is the period we're now. And once public hearings have taken place, city council then submits proposed budget to the mayor, and who will then approve and submit the final budget by the end of December. And then once the budget is implemented, governmental units, they're monitored throughout the fiscal year and then evaluated at the end to inform the budget process for the following year. So some examples of increases we've seen this year for next fiscal year is $5 million for the operation of a new 48th Ave shelter. There was $1 million that was set aside for the STAR program. There's a $300,000 increase for the Immigrant Legal Defense Fund. And so understanding the process and knowing that we are in the period where city council is gathering input from the public, we want to make sure our voices are heard. Because they've already committed to $1 million increase for the STAR program, like Jen mentioned, a good way to let them know that we appreciate that commitment and that we are paying attention is to thank them. So what we've done is we've drafted an email, and I'm going to drop it in the chat so that you have access to it. We've drafted an email, one for Denver and one for just other city council members outside of Denver, to let them know that we're paying attention right now. So the message for council reads as follows. So it says, Dear local city council members, in recent months, the urgency to re-examine the role of policing in our communities has been at the forefront of issues that demand action by our local elected officials. As a Denver resident, I want to thank you for acknowledging the importance of the STAR program and in the 2021 city budget as an alternative to policing, particularly in response to non-threatening and mental health situations. Thank you again for hearing our calls to action and investing in alternatives that build trust and community safety. Your constituent and then your name. So if you are in Denver, what you can do right now is you can either copy that link that I posted. You can also click on it, see if that works. And then just copy and paste that, the email template. And there's also a link that includes all of the Denver City Council members. So that's one way to let them know we're paying attention. We saw that you decided to set aside funding for the STAR program. We want that to continue. So thank you. We're going to keep paying attention. The next email draft that we have is for those who are not in Denver, but want their city council members or local elected officials to start paying attention and taking action on this particular issue. So that one reads as follows. Dear elected official, over the summer, our country witnessed pervasive racism that continues to plague our criminal legal system. The urgency to confront the stark realities of racialized policing in our society is at the forefront of issues demanding to be addressed by our local elected officials. Right now, cities across the country are rethinking municipal budgets and reevaluating whether the police are doing their jobs that could be handled by civilian-led services that ensure public safety. We have a unique opportunity to invest shared vision of community safety, infrastructure, and recovery that does not rely on law enforcement. As your constituent, I'm asking you to support local efforts to invest in community services that provide resources and expertise to those in vulnerable situations. Thank you for your attention to this urgent matter. Your constituent and your name. So obviously there's a stark difference between the first and the second one. The first one, again, we are thanking, we are reinforcing their positive behavior, and we don't want to, lecture them too much on what they should do because they've already done it. So we want to keep that up. The second one, we're really naming that this is an urgent matter and this is something that really is impacting our communities right now, and we need to pay attention to that. So yes, I will kick it back to Jess. I think we might be, oh, actually, no, one more. Another call to action that you can also do is you can provide us, as Jen was talking about, and Jess also, is that we are really honing in on the fact that you yourself are one of the strongest messengers, and you can advocate within your personal relationships, you can advocate in your communities. We want to provide trainings and tools for that. And one of the ways we're doing it is that is through a tool called Empower, where we can send you a call to action, and be like, hey, this just came up. Can you talk to your friends about this right now? Can you talk to your family members? And in the app, you can track all the conversations you've had. I did this. And it's really, the goal of it is to build you as a community leader, as an organizer, as someone who wants to take action and make change within your communities. So what you can do right now also is provide us your email, and we will contact you and make sure you are involved and in the know about those trainings and those opportunities to build on your organizing leadership. So yeah, I'll kick it back to Jess for questions.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me? I can't figure out whether I'm on mute or not. Cool. So thank you so much, both to Jen and Julian, for really walking us through what that local advocacy looks like and really helping us gather the tools to begin this work. With that, I think we just open it up for questions. Again, you know, we're here to answer as well as our senior policy counsel, Rebecca Wallace, is also with us to answer any questions that we can.
That's great, Jess. I just wanted to talk really quickly and maybe get other people's opinions. A question that's in the chat from Trina is, would it be appropriate to call STAR program for domestic violence concerns? Is this an area where they could provide services?
That is a good question. I'm not entirely sure in terms of the breadth of the calls that they receive. Essentially, my understanding, and Rebecca, please let me know if I'm incorrect, is that when someone calls 911, that dispatch usually will determine from there whether or not that's something that requires a police contact or that it could be something that the STAR program handles, and they're the ones to channel those calls from there. Is that accurate, Rebecca?
I think it is, Jess, and I don't think at this time that the STAR program would refer domestic violence calls. I mean, that the dispatch would refer domestic violence calls to the STAR program. But I think in our vision of community safety, we would envision trained professionals who are who are skilled with both victims of domestic violence and perpetrators, oftentimes whom there's much overlap with both of those groups, to be able to go to a domestic violence circumstance without having to have police on the scene, especially given that there's a view by the police that someone must be arrested at every single domestic violence call, which is another reason I think they would not be set. Oh, and I see Elizabeth chiming in. So I'm glad to know that I think that this is accurate. So, you know, we would want to see a broad expansion of the STAR program. I think a lot of their work is focused in the Civic Center area right now and focused incredibly on people, mostly on people experiencing homelessness and people in mental health crisis. It's a good first step, needs to be dramatically expanded.
Thank you.
There's another question, and it is, will the presentation be available after today? And yes, it will be. Go ahead, tell them where it's going to be available.
Yes, and so we have been hosting our webinars on advocacy from home, and certainly we can put the link in the chat. That is where we have a lot of our webinars that we've been doing during this pandemic season, and that includes these webinars. And so you'll definitely be getting a message if you signed up through People Power, getting a message from us, you know, giving you not only the link to the video, but also links to get the presentation slides as well as the cheat sheets for contacting your local representative, or how to go about finding out who your local representative is. So we will definitely be providing that, as well as I've been mentioning in the last two webinars, we've been working kind of like on a resource study guide on, you know, divestment. And so with each webinar, we've been updating it with more materials, and we'll be doing that as well for Advocacy 101 in terms of kind of really getting folks comfortable with what that looks like. I think we even have a link for even students who may be interested in taking on this issue, how they can go about reaching out to the folks that they know to bring them along on this journey.
Great. I'm trying to get that link in the chat. And then we have a question about how can we advocate for divesting in small towns like Louisville, I think that's how you say it. I've only lived here 40 years. Who doesn't have data on traffic stops and race, etc., and is in, you know, lower in crime. So how do you advocate in those smaller towns where you really don't have as much data to use?
Well, I don't know, Rebecca, if you have a sense of like whether or not having that data is useful in order to make that case. And I'll also open it up to Jen in terms of how you advocate in even smaller towns. But, you know, does it matter to have that data ready in order to make the case, or is that we know, you know, across the country, so many places have such large budgets when it comes to police enforcement, and whatever resources they can begin shifting to more community services is a win either way. But I want your, yeah, I want both of your thoughts on that.
I'll let Jen, as the expert, discuss what is most persuasive from an organizing perspective, but I do want to share that there is going to be, that there may be more data already available than you think, and a lot of that is available through open records, like, and one can just send in a request to say, you know, for the last year, how many traffic stops divided by race, you know, that can happen, and some jurisdictions have it, but every jurisdiction should have it within the next year and a half, because part of one of the key reforms in Senate Bill 217, which was the policing bill that passed this past session, was data collection for every single jurisdiction in the entire state on traffic stops, searches, use of force, and divided by and broken down by race. And when you then you then can compare from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so you can see, you know, how your jurisdiction compares to others. You can compare the percentages in the data to the percentage of, if you want to look at race, for instance, different races within that one jurisdiction. So that data should be readily available. And you know, we're certainly hoping to, as it becomes available, to make that more available for activists. That would be a hope.
If there's ever a place to make that data more available to activists, it would be the ACLU. So we'll work on all of that. And I would also say that even if you don't have that data yet, doesn't mean you can't start building the momentum and narrative, right? And start doing that messaging work and that organizing work, and start building those relationships with city councilors. And it would actually be even more effective that if you do have more clarity for the next budget cycle, you have already built this power and this momentum. So don't let that stop you from starting some of that work. And I would love to make myself available if you need help brainstorming on anything advocacy or finding your representative. Like that's what we do.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So folks, if you have other questions, now's the time. Well, we've got some thank yous coming in, and we thank you all for joining us today. And I'm stalling for more questions. And well, I will leave you all with this one idea. Jen talked a lot about how you are the most powerful messenger for your friends and family. And now is the time to make sure your friends, your family, your neighbor next door are going to vote. So your last call to action, besides all the great call to action that you got today, was let's make sure everyone we know is informed. We have an ACLU voter guide that can help on some of the issues. And there's many other great voter guides out there. Let's make sure they're informed, and let's make sure they're voting. And if you need information about where and how to vote, you can go to our voting page at aclu-co.org. So I think I've stalled quite enough with my public service message for the day. Thank you, Rebecca, Jen, Julian, Jess, and Elizabeth, who chimed in there. Any last words, Jess, before we shut it down?
No, again, just, you know, for folks that have been with us throughout the month, attending these webinars, thank you again. for going on this journey with us and sharing with you why this issue is so important. And what I hope, I'm really looking forward to is, now that we've been talking about the divestment kind of side of this issue, that future conversations again are, what does alternative safety look like, and that we can then begin to start looking at those organizations, look at those services that are providing this new vision of safety. So then that way, as we continue to go on, and as budgets keep coming up, we know exactly the programs and the services that we do want funded, and again, just continuing that momentum, and then ensuring that, again, like our neighbors are safe, that we are safe, and that it doesn't have to be this way. And if we are all kind of working again with a shared vision, we can change that. I know that certainly we probably are so used to the current policing system that we don't know any different, or we don't know how to imagine anything different. But that's why we're here working on it, because we can imagine something different, and we can work towards that goal. So with that, thank you so much.